Hello, everyone. It's the Grouchy Historian back here for the Unit 2 of our AP American Government video series. Wanted to, in the first video, we kind of went over the Constitution and what the AP study guide calls the framework of American government. So now we're going to get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts, as I like to say, of actually how the sausage gets made, right? So the rest of the course here, once you get past the Constitution, which is sort of the theory of how the American government works, the rest of these units get into the practical issues of how we are governed and how politics works. So Unit 2, interestingly enough, the very first thing we go to after the Constitution is public opinion and the media. Interesting choice. So you got to ask, why is this the second unit? In other words, what is public opinion and why is it important? Well, everything in government and politics is shaped by public opinion. Okay, let's break it down. One of the advantages of the Grouchy Historian being your guide through the APA government is I'm going to get behind the scenes and give you the rest of the story, as that great American storyteller Paul Harvey used to say. So everything in government politics is shaped by public opinion. And on the other flip side, everyone in government politics attempts to shape public opinion. More on that in a second. So let's get down to brass tacks. First and foremost, politicians want to be reelected. Okay, let's just put that out there on the table. Politicians want to be reelected. In fact, it's pretty much an old saying that the first thing a politician does once he gets into office is he starts running for reelection. Pretty true. Haven't seen anything to convince me otherwise. Therefore, politicians tend to be sensitive to the important issues for their voters. Again, sometimes they lead, sometimes they follow. They want to know what are the voters thinking about? What are they doing? Now, interesting enough, little historical aside here. Again, this is nothing new. People are like, oh, we just have all these polls and, public opinion and et cetera. From the very beginning, when George Washington took office in 1789, all of the founders in that first American government, right? Washington was the first president, the first Congress, the first House of Representatives had the first Senate. They were all very, very aware that they were being watched by their fellow citizens. In the lines of one of my favorite movies, they were being weighed, they were being measured, and they did not want to be found wanting. So George Washington in particular was a very astute gatherer and sifter of public opinion through correspondence with his friends, with his fellow politicians, with other people in the government. Washington was very interested in what people were thinking, in particular when he had a big decision to make. So this is not a new thing. Politicians are very, very aware that one misstep and they could be done politically. Now, how do they do this? Well, there's a lot of ways. The one thing that the study guide talked about immediately was polls. Now, we can have all kinds of discussions about polls. Let me just say this. They can be spot on or they can be wildly off. It all depends on how the poll is constructed and take it. Typically, polls are done by telephone. Let's just take an example. Typically, polls are done by telephone. So pollsters call people at home. Now, what's the problem with that? There's an entire generation that don't have landlines anymore. They do everything by cell. So if you're just polling people that you can get their phone number from their local telephone company, your chances are you're missing a big demographic, right? Second, when you're taking a political poll, how do you gather your sample? There is a huge food fight, huge discussions, huge flinging of invectives on how much of a poll is split up between so-called, we'll talk about this more in a minute too, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, right? Ideally, you would want a third, a third, and a third. Because, or if you're really doing your homework, you might look and see for a particular state, how many people in that state are registered Republicans, how many are registered Democrats, how many are registered independents, and then you would choose your sample then. Polling is all about statistics, right? Somebody said recently, and I kind of agree with them because I think it's kind of genius. Instead of shoving a bunch of algebra and calculus down students' throats in school, and I understand if you want to be an engineer, you got to take calculus and algebra and all that good stuff, but I got to tell you, I took plenty of calculus differential equations when I went to the Naval Academy. How many times have I used it? 0. Anyway, but statistics would be a great course for every high school student to take and understand, because our lives are greatly governed by statistics, including a huge amount of politics, particularly public opinion. So when people tout polls as like, oh, this poll says this poll says that, you have to dig into the underlying mechanics of how the poll is done. Because, for example, in the 2016 presidential election, every pollster said that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and they were wrong. And then when they went back, they said, oh, well, maybe we oversampled here and we didn't sample there. And, so you just have to take any poll, as my daddy used to say, with a big grain of salt. Now, there are some websites that try to average polls and blend polls together. Having taken a statistical analysis course, I could tell you that nothing gets you in trouble more factually than using averages. So be careful of that too. Okay, but polls are important. Politicians love them. They use them all the time to find out what the lay of the land is. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. And of course, everything in politics is driven by ideology. What do the voters want out of government, right? Again, the book really kind of breaks it down at a really high level into what they call conservatives, liberals, and moderates. Okay, now I'm not going to get into this too much because hopefully this is fairly obvious, that conservatives as a tendency stress individual freedom, responsibility, limited government, low taxes. Liberals like lots of government oversight and regulation, and they want to use the government to make things fair. Now, I use this word with quotation marks because it's fair, like what is fair, right? So I'll just leave that there and you can decide that for yourself. But keep in mind that what's fair is in the eye of the beholder. Just saying. Moderates. Now, this is a term that I'm not a big fan of. I'll be perfectly honest and blunt and share my opinion. There's no such thing as a moderate, in my opinion. In my opinion, there's no such thing as a moderate. There's just a liberal who doesn't want to admit it. Let's just be honest. Now, some moderates can be fiscally, we'll talk about that some more, conservative, but they're very liberal on social issues. Mostly, in my opinion, which is why I put it here, they don't believe in much of anything. But they tend to vote more on the liberal side because they're all liberal on social issues. Another way of phrasing this is libertarians. Now, this can be kind of a nebulous term because libertarians and conservatives can have a lot of interests in common, but libertarians are literally like, hey, if it feels good, do it. We can discuss that some more later. But for purposes of the test, they break it up into conservatives, liberals, and moderates. Okay. Now, what determines your ideology, right? Again, they go into a lot of different factors: race, religion, gender, your income, your education level, your region. I think what they leave out is family, right? I mean, let's be honest. For the most part, children are heavily influenced by their parents' politics. Now, this is not always true. Sadly, in my opinion, there are many parents that are raised in good conservative Christian homes that go off to college and come back raging Marxists. Just putting it out there. And I've seen it. It's kind of true. But for the most part, I would say that family is a significantly undervalued influence in determining your ideology. These others are certainly important, certainly applicable, but I don't think you can underestimate the importance of family. Now, let's turn to my favorite topic, the mass media, which is trying to set the agenda. So, again, grouchy historian. I'm just going to say this because I have observed this for almost 40 years, since I was a young midshipman And we used to have to, as part of our midshipman plebe sort of upbringing, we'll call it, had to read 2 newspaper articles every day. I'm sorry, 2 newspaper articles and a sports article every day. So what we would do is, in our room, one of us would subscribe to the Washington Post, one of us would subscribe to the Washington Times, and the other poor person, I think, had to subscribe to either the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. So we got a variety of opinions. And let me tell you, there was a reason when we were midshipmen in 1983 that we called the Washington Post Pravda on the Potomac. Just saying. So let's just say that there's no such thing, in my opinion, as newspapermen anymore. Those are dead, extinct. Those have been gone since at least about 2000. There really aren't any journalists anymore. Those have pretty much been dead, extinct since about, I don't know, 2008. What we now have are, what would we call them? They are advocates. Yes, I said that. I mean it. Again, not on the test, but I like to give you a little extra context. The media has become advocates for one side, one position or the other. They no longer report the who, what, why, when, where, how that we might have learned if anybody took journalism in high school back in the 1980s. They're all about shaping the story to suit an agenda. Now, why do they do this? Well, let's be honest. Back in the day, in my day, in 1983, you had newspapers and you had TV nightly news. That was it. That's pretty much your only source of news. We did have CNN. CNN started when I was in high school, and it was amazing. It's like, ooh, you can get the news anytime. But what happened was this sort of monopoly on the media allowed newspapers, news magazines, broadcast news shows, cable news to control, and I'm going to use that word, control the agenda and tone of political discussion, either overtly or by neglecting certain stories. And guess what? They still do it now. They still do it now. However, with the internet and podcasts and talk radio and all kinds of other sources of information, the newspapers are dying, let's be honest, as an economic model. Print newspapers are dying. They probably won't last another decade. News magazines, dying, most of the good ones. Newsweek and Time used to be decent. The U.S. News and World Report used to be pretty good. They're mostly dead, and what's left of them is pretty much just advocacy journals. Not a lot of hard news. Lots of editorials. The line between news reporting and editorials has really blurred in the last decade. So there are many alternative sources of news and information. However, that doesn't mean there are many quality alternative sources of news and information, right? Now we have social media being a driver and a reporter of the agenda, not news, but the agenda. And it is often wrong without context or simply pushing an agenda, right? If you ever spend a lot of time on Twitter, wowza, you kind of feel like you got to wash your hands when you're done. You know what I'm saying? Facebook, don't even get me started. There's a lot of garbage out there. On the left and the right and the middle, it's just garbage. And it's blatantly biased toward one side or the other. They don't even pretend anymore. This is the important difference that I always love between the British media and the American media. The British media, they made no bones about it. This paper was conservative, or, this paper was the Tory paper, this paper was the liberal paper, this paper was the wacko leftist paper, and they were proud of it, right? If you've ever read the difference between the Times of London and the Guardian, it's like Venus and Mars, totally different, right? If you read the Wall Street Journal versus the Washington Post, Venus and Mars, but the Washington Post still maintains that they're an objective source of news. No. But importantly, politicians also pay attention to the media, and they also manipulate the media, and they allow the media to manipulate them. So again, and by the way, historically speaking, oh yeah, this was so true in Washington's time, right? Again, back in that day, there was no doubt which newspaper was pro-federalist, pro-Republican, hated Washington, liked Washington. The politicians literally back then used newspapers as their mouthpieces, kind of like now, but they were a little more subtle about it. So the idea that all of a sudden the media is just like biased and taking sides and political, no, it's always been that way. We've just pretended for like 100 years that the newspapers were unbiased and objective. And it was a lie, because it's never been that way from the founding of our country. Newspapers, medias have taken sides. So just keep that in mind, again, as you go through the test and as you're going through class. Listen very critically about how they talk about the media, because you have to have the ability, kind of like when you're going through historical sources. If you've seen my videos on AP American and world history, you have to be able to think through the noise to get to the facts. And you have to decide what set of sources are you going to use to help educate and inform yourself. Some people only want to see stuff that confirms their own biases and opinions. I don't do that personally. I try to read a wide variety of sources. It drives me nuts sometimes, not gonna lie. It drives me absolutely crazy. But it's useful to see the full spectrum of political thought and opinion to help you form your own thoughts and opinions. Okay, so as you go through the course, remember, everything in politics is about setting an agenda. It's about shaping public opinion. It's about determining public opinion. For if you're a politician, it's about getting elected again. And it's about driving your public policy. We're going to talk about that some more a little bit shortly. So hopefully you found this useful as a good introduction. And yes, unlike the other courses, AP Government, yeah, you're going to get a little extra grouchy historian here. So strap in, hang on, it's going to be fun.